America, we have two labor markets. We've got the US and Canada, which are broadly the same, high tech, and then we've got Mexico, which does middle manufacturing very well. It's the delta between them that gives you good economies of scale and network effects for electronics manufacturing because there's so many steps. Well, only in the US Mexico border region do we get that interface. So we don't have the 12-step labor market that the Asians have, which means we're going to have to retool everything that we bring back in the electronics space in order to do it at scale. And that's going to look very different. And we are going to have to make that up as we go. And that will probably be the economic sector where we feel the most pain from the changes because it's going to take the longest. So Mexico and Colombia both have Atlantic and Pacific ports. And Colombia is very similar in economic structure to where Mexico was 15 to 25 years ago. So more skilled than their price point would suggest. And the Colombians are absolutely going to be an indelible part of whatever comes next for the greater NAFTA system. It'll take them a little bit longer to get up and running than it did the Mexicans because Mexico, it's right up on the US border. So it's very easy for American entrepreneurs to reach south, find partners, and build out. Colombia is not just in a different continent. Most of the population lives on the sides of mountains. So you've got tropics in the lowlands and snowcaps and tundra at the top. People live in the middle. And that makes the infrastructure question a really important one. It's not that the infrastructure is not in place, it is, but it's not built out to supply and support a mass manufacturing culture, which is what we need them to do. That's going to take some time too. No. Their last 15 years have gotten progressively better. The Civil War is over. FARC is gone. I don't mean to suggest that cocaine has vanished from their world, but they're not facing the degree of state challenge that they have for most of their history. News. We were very lucky this calendar year. We only had a disruption out of the Russian space for fertilizer production of about 1/3. And Mother Nature was very kind to us the world over. Most of the world's farmers had great weather all year long. And everyone had a fertilizer reserve. Well, the amount of stuff that is getting broken down in the Russian system is accelerating. Mother Nature is probably going to be her normal self next year. Yeah. The initial forecast, especially for the Western Hemisphere, don't look great. And everyone has already used their reserves. So we should expect significant fertilizer shortages sometime in 2023. The country to watch is Brazil, because they're the world's largest fertilizer importer. And they're a big enough country, they've got the heft to get it. And if they start having problems, you know that there are dozens of smaller countries out there that are already in crisis point. So we'll probably see significant drops in agricultural output next year, especially in the second half of next year, which should suggest that we're going to have significant problems with food supply on a global scale in the months that follow. US, Canada, Mexico is obviously at the top of the list. Colombia, Australia, Japan, and assuming they can get their head out of their ass, the Brits, are probably going to be part of the new network that works. And most of the Western Hemisphere that was not on that list is at a minimum going to be able to benefit from a relatively placid security environment. So they're not going to be dealing with a lot of the changes that are happening in the Eastern Hemisphere. In fact, a lot of these countries are commodities exporters. And so in that sort of environment where your commodities can still be produced, assuming you get the fertilizer, but you don't have to worry about a security concern, your ability to sell high is very promising. The biggest loser by far is China. Everything about China's functionality is dependent on a globalization and a demographic moment that has passed. And they are definitely not going to survive as a country, much less as an economy. I think we're in the final decade of the European Union, because without that Russian energy, there is no German manufacturing model. And without the German manufacturing model, you don't have the money that is used to keep the EU in existence. So, I mean, what can you imagine what would happen with the Greek debt crisis if the Germans didn't have the capacity to write a check? Mm-hmm. That's the environment we're going to be in a few years. Add in terminal demographics, and parts of Europe can go their own way and be reasonably successful. Scandinavia, I'm very bullish on. France, I'm very bullish on. But the rest of it looks really, really dangerous. Wow. And then I am really concerned about Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, because they import almost every speck of their potash and their phosphate and their nitrogen fertilizer. and they're food importers on top of that.
Oh.
State failure. India is a great example of a country that can sustain a very high degree of chaos and just keep on chugging along. But most countries in this part of the world are not as strong as India. No, that's about it.
That's about it.
I mean, the food issue is the issue that gives me nightmares because I don't see a way to fix it. It takes 10 years to bring a new potash production facility online. And the Canadians got started as soon as the war began back in March. Well, I mean, they started in March, the war started in February. But they're hoping they can speed it up and get meaningful replacement volumes up by 2029. I have an interesting realignment of what is normal in the United States over the next 20 years, because we've had this populist rise up represented by Biden and Trump, but we're also going to be probably taking in 40 or 50 million migrants over the course of the next 20, 25 years.
Wow.
That is going to change our complexion because these are not going to be people who walked
Literally.
here. These are going to be people mostly from advanced countries with degrees and experience who can have an immediate value-added impact that is quite a bit.
But at the end of World War II, the Americans scrapped the old imperial system that generated the war. And we said that we would patrol the global ocean so that anyone could play. You could sail anywhere at any time, interface with any partner, participate in any manufacturing, access any raw commodity, and sell into any market. If in exchange, you would side with us against the Soviets. And that created the world that we know. And it sounds like just a simple guns for butter deal, but you got to remember how fractured everything was before 1945.
Mm-hmm.
If you were in a country that didn't have oil, then you didn't industrialize. If you were in a country that didn't have farmland, then your population was minuscule. Globalization allowed everyone to sell what they were good at and buy what they weren't good at. And everyone in the world became a specialist. And so we now have soy on farms in Iowa that's the most productive in the world. But we also have semiconductors coming out of Taiwan, a country that was pre-industrial by every definition until very recently. And every part of the world can play in it. And that has encouraged this mass diversification, and it's encouraged this mass explosion in economic activity, particularly once the Cold War ended in 1992. But it was always artificial. And it was always based on the Americans continuing to hold up the ceiling. The United States has been edging away from that ever since 1992 when the Cold War ended, and we're in the final days of that right now. And that's only kind of half of it, is when you allow everyone to participate in global trade, people move off the farm and they take services and manufacturing jobs in town. On the farm, kids are free labor. You have a bunch. In town, kids are really, really expensive pieces of loud, annoying furniture.
Right.
Have fewer because adults aren't stupid.
Yeah.
You play that forward for 70 years, and we have had a population bust in the making, global in scope for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the advanced world has now aged past the point of no return. That includes countries like China. So in this coming decade, it's not just that we're going to see populations aging out of being competitive. We're going to see populations aging out of being sustainable and actually being countries. One of the many, many, many outcomes of the 2020s is the end of China as a unified nation state and an economy. But this has all been hardwired in now for 40 years, and we are finally reaching the point where the page turns.
What will happen in 5 to 7 decades? Other countries just invade Japan's land because there's just no one there to protect it?
Every country is going to have its own story because every country started aging at a different point and they started aging at a different rate, and how you live in urban versus rural zones is dependent upon the local geography. So an example on the positive side, we started industrializing in the United States 200 years ago. So for us, this hasn't been a 40, 50-year process. This has been a 200-year process. And so our birth rate has dropped incrementally that entire time, but we've adapted to